The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the residential streets of Beaumont, Texas, when the first emergency sirens began their haunting wail. Maria Gonzalez was folding laundry in her small two-bedroom home when the ground beneath her feet started to tremble. Outside, the April sky had turned an ominous shade of green-gray, and the wind was picking up something fierce. "Miguel, get away from that window," she called to her 8-year-old son, who was pressed against the glass, watching debris fly past their front yard. The boy's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and fascination as tree branches and pieces of roofing material danced through the air like angry spirits. 3 blocks away, Tom Henderson was securing the last of his patio furniture when his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, came rushing over. The elderly woman's silver hair was whipping around her face as she clutched a small carrier. With her tabby cat inside, "Tom, honey, my basement's flooding already, and I can hear something real bad coming this way," she said, her voice shaking. "The radio's saying it's gonna be worse than anything we've seen in 20 years. Tom nodded grimly, his weathered hands gripping the rope he'd been using to tie down his outdoor equipment. He'd lived in this neighborhood for 35 years, survived Hurricane Rita, and weathered plenty of storms. But something about this one felt different. The air itself seemed to be vibrating with an energy that made his skin crawl. "Come on, Mrs. Patterson. Y'all can ride it out with me and Sarah. We got plenty of room, and our house is on higher ground." As they hurried toward his front door, the first real wave of wind hit them like a freight train. Mrs. Patterson stumbled, and Tom caught her arm, steadying her as they fought their way against the growing storm. Behind them, they could hear the sound of glass breaking and metal scraping against concrete. Inside the Henderson house, Sarah was filling every available container with water while listening to the emergency broadcast. On their battery-powered radio, the reporter's voice was steady but urgent. "Unprecedented weather system moving through East Texas. Residents are advised to seek immediate shelter. Wind speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour. Flash flooding expected in low-lying areas. How bad is it looking out there?" Sarah asked as Tom and Mrs. Patterson stumbled through the door, both soaked from the brief sprint across the yard. "Bad enough," Tom replied, helping Mrs. Patterson to a chair, "and it's just getting started." "Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below, and leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue. By evening, the storm had transformed their quiet neighborhood into something unrecognizable. Power lines were down, several houses had lost their roofs, and the street was flooded with 3 feet of muddy water. The Gonzalez family had been forced to evacuate to the community center when their home's foundation began to crack, while the Hendersons and Mrs. Patterson huddled in the interior hallway, listening to the storm tear their world apart outside. When dawn finally broke, revealing the full extent of the damage, the survivors emerged to find their community forever changed. But they had no idea that this moment of devastation would soon bring them face to face with the most powerful man in Texas, and that their stories of loss and resilience would become the foundation for something much bigger than any of them could have imagined. Governor Greg Abbott wheeled his chair closer to the bank of monitors in the Texas State Operations Center, his jaw set in a hard line as he surveyed the damage reports streaming in from across East Texas. The emergency management team had been working around the clock, and the numbers were staggering. Over 300 homes damaged or destroyed, 15,000 people without power, and entire communities cut off by flooding. "Sir, we're getting reports that the Federal Emergency Management Agency is going to take at least 2 weeks to get boots on the ground," said Jennifer Martinez, his chief of staff, her voice tight with frustration. "They're saying they need to complete their assessment protocols first." Abbott's fingers drummed against the armrest of his wheelchair, a habit his staff had learned to recognize when he was working through a problem. 2 weeks. These folks don't have 2 weeks. They need help now. Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick stepped forward, his own face grim. "Greg, I've been talking to the mayors from the affected areas. They're saying people are sleeping in their cars, running out of food, and the local shelters are at capacity. This is going to be a disaster if we don't act fast. Then we don't wait for the federal government, Abbott said firmly. We never have, and we're not starting now. Get me a direct line to the National Guard, and I want the state emergency fund activated within the hour. The governor's decisive tone sent a ripple of purposeful energy through the room. This was the Greg Abbott that Texas had come to know. Over his years in office, the man who'd never backed down from a fight, whether it was against federal overreach or natural disasters. "Sir," interrupted Captain Rodriguez from the Texas Department of Public Safety, "we've got reports that some of the hardest hit areas still can't be reached by conventional vehicles. The roads are washed out and there's debris everywhere." Abbott nodded. "Then we use helicopters. I want rescue teams in the air within 2 hours. And I want supply drops starting immediately. Food, water, medical supplies, whatever these people need." As his staff scattered to implement his orders, Abbott remained at the monitors, studying the satellite images of the destruction. Each damaged home represented a family in crisis, and he knew that government efficiency would only go so far. What these people needed was to know that they weren't forgotten, that their government was fighting for them. "Jennifer," he called to his chief of staff, "clear my schedule for the next 3 days. I'm going down there." "Sir, the roads are still dangerous, and I said clear my schedule." Abbott's voice carried the authority of a man who'd spent decades making tough decisions. If these families are living in shelters and sleeping in their cars, then their governor needs to be there with them. Set up meetings with the local officials, but more importantly, I want to meet with the affected families. I want to hear their stories firsthand. Jennifer nodded, already pulling out her phone to make the necessary arrangements. She'd worked with Abbott long enough to know that when he made up his mind about something, especially when it involved serving the people of Texas, there was no changing it. "And Jennifer," Abbott added, his voice softening slightly, "make sure the press knows this isn't a photo opportunity. This is about listening to our people and figuring out how we can help them rebuild their lives." As the sun set over Austin, Governor Abbott was already planning his trip to the disaster zone. He'd built his political career on the principle that government should serve the people, not the other way around. And he was about to put that principle to the test in the most personal way possible. The storm had taken much from the people of East Texas, but it was about to give them something unexpected, a chance to see their governor, not as a distant political figure, but as a man who understood struggle, resilience, and the true meaning of Texas Strong. The helicopter touched down on the makeshift landing pad at Beaumont High School at 7:30 a.m., its rotors whipping up clouds of dust and debris that still littered the area from the storm. Governor Abbott transferred smoothly from the aircraft to his wheelchair, his security detail and staff forming a protective circle around him as they made their way toward the school building that had been converted into the primary emergency shelter. Principal Jana Thompson met them at the entrance, her usually neat appearance disheveled after 3 days of managing the crisis. "Governor Abbott, thank you for coming. I have to warn you, it's pretty rough in there. We've got about 400 people crammed into spaces meant for maybe 100, and emotions are running pretty high." Abbott nodded, his expression serious. "I'm not here for the easy conversations, Jana. These folks have been through hell, and they deserve to have their voices heard." As they entered the main gymnasium, the scope of the human drama became immediately apparent. Families huddled on cots and air mattresses, their possessions reduced to whatever they'd been able to grab in plastic bags and cardboard boxes. Children cried from exhaustion and confusion, while their parents wore the hollow-eyed look of people who'd lost everything and were trying to figure out what came next. Maria Gonzalez was helping her son Miguel with his coloring book when she noticed the commotion near the entrance. She didn't immediately recognize the man in the wheelchair, but something about the way people were gathering around him made her curious. "Mama, who's that man?" Miguel asked, looking up from his drawing of a house. "The house they'd lost 3 days ago." "I don't know, Mio," she replied, smoothing his dark hair, "but he looks important." Across the gymnasium, Tom Henderson was sharing a thermos of coffee with Mrs. Patterson when he spotted the governor's entourage. Unlike Maria, Tom recognized Abbott immediately. he'd voted for him in the last election, and he'd been following his career since his days as attorney general. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom muttered, earning a sharp look from Mrs. Patterson. "Sorry, ma'am, but that's Governor Abbott. He actually came." Mrs. Patterson squinted across the room. "Are you sure? What would the governor be doing here?" "I reckon we're about to find out," Tom replied, standing up as Abbott's group moved closer to their section of the gymnasium. Abbott had requested that his visit be as informal as possible, with minimal media presence and no staged events. He wanted to move through the shelter at his own pace, stopping to talk with families without the pressure of cameras or tight schedules. His first stop was at a corner, where a young mother was trying to comfort her crying baby. The woman looked up with surprise as the governor approached. "I'm Greg Abbott," he said simply, extending his hand. "I'm here to listen to what you and your family need." The woman, barely out of her teens, looked overwhelmed. "Governor, I don't know what to say. We lost our trailer, and my husband's been trying to find work. But most of the businesses in our area are closed now because of the damage." Abbott pulled his wheelchair closer, his voice gentle but focused. "What's your name? And what can we do to help you get back on your feet?" As word spread through the shelter that the governor was there, not for a quick photo opportunity, but for real conversations, more people began to gather. Some were skeptical, having been disappointed by politicians before, while others were simply grateful that someone in a position of power was paying attention to their plight. Maria Gonzalez found herself in the growing crowd, still holding Miguel's hand. She'd never imagined she'd have the opportunity to speak directly to the governor. But as she watched him engage with each family patiently and respectfully, she began to think that maybe, just maybe, this might be different. The morning was just beginning, but already Abbott could see that this visit was going to be unlike anything he'd experienced in his political career. These weren't constituents at a town hall or supporters at a rally. These were Texans who'd lost everything and were looking for hope, and he was determined to give them reasons to believe that better days were ahead. Governor Abbott had been in the shelter for nearly an hour when he found himself face to face with Maria Gonzalez. She'd been watching from a distance, unsure whether to approach, but when their eyes met across the crowded gymnasium, something in his expression encouraged her to step forward. "Governor Abbott," she said hesitantly, her accent adding a musical quality to her words. "I'm Maria Gonzalez. This is my son, Miguel." Abbott smiled warmly at the 8-year-old, who was clutching a coloring book against his chest. "Hello, Miguel. That's a fine drawing you've got there. Is that your house?" Miguel nodded solemnly. "It was our house, but the storm took it away." The simple honesty of the child's words hit Abbott harder than any political briefing could have. He'd read the damage reports, seen the statistics, but hearing it from a young boy who'd lost his home made the crisis feel immediate and personal. "Miguel, can you tell me what happened?" Abbott asked gently, positioning his wheelchair so he was at the boy's eye level. "The ground was shaking, and Mama said we had to leave real quick," Miguel explained, his voice gaining confidence. "We took some clothes and my favorite toy car, but we had to leave everything else. Our cat, Whiskers, ran away, and I don't know where she is." Maria placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. "We've been here 3 days now, Governor. Miguel hasn't been sleeping well, and I don't know what we're going to do. The house had some damage from the last hurricane, and we were still paying on those repairs. Now it's completely gone." Abbott listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "Maria, what kind of work do you do?" "I clean houses, mostly for folks in the nicer neighborhoods, but some of them lost their homes too. And others, well, they don't need cleaning services right now when they're dealing with their own problems." And Miguel's father, Maria's face tightened slightly. "He's not in the picture, Governor. It's just me and Miguel." Abbott nodded with understanding. He'd heard similar stories countless times during his years in public service, but it never got easier. Single mothers struggling to provide for their children, working multiple jobs just to make ends meet, and then having what little they'd built swept away by forces beyond their control. "Miguel," Abbott said, turning back to the boy, "I want you to know that there are a lot of people working very hard to help you and your mama. We're going to make sure you have a place to live, and we're going to help find Whiskers too." "Really?" Miguel's eyes lit up with hope. "Really? That's a promise from your governor." As they talked, Tom Henderson had been watching from across the room. He'd been waiting for his chance to speak with Abbott, but seeing the governor's interaction with the young family reminded him of why he'd supported the man in the first place. This wasn't political theater. Abbott was genuinely engaged with these people's problems. When Abbott finished with Maria and Miguel, Tom approached with Mrs. Patterson leaning on his arm. "Governor, I'm Tom Henderson, and this is my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. We're grateful you came out here." Abbott shook hands with both of them. "Tom, Mrs. Patterson, thank you for taking the time to talk with me. How are y'all holding up?" "Well, sir, our houses are still standing, but the damage is pretty significant," Tom replied. "Mrs. Patterson here lost her basement to flooding, and my roof's got a hole you could drive a truck through. But we're the lucky ones. At least we've got somewhere to go back to." Mrs. Patterson, who'd been quiet until now, spoke up with a shaky voice. "Governor, I've lived in this community for 47 years. I've seen storms before, but this one, it's different. It's not just the damage to the buildings, it's the people. Families are scattered, businesses are closed, and folks are talking about leaving for good." Abbott leaned forward in his wheelchair, his attention fully focused on the elderly woman. "Mrs. Patterson, what would it take to keep people here? What would convince them to stay and rebuild?" "Hope," she said simply. "People need to believe that there's a future worth staying for. They need to know that if they invest their time and money in rebuilding, they won't be forgotten when the next crisis hits." Tom nodded in agreement. "She's right, Governor. We need more than just emergency aid. We need to know that the state is committed to helping our community come back stronger than before." Abbott was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd heard. These weren't unreasonable demands or partisan complaints. These were practical concerns from people who'd been through hell and were trying to figure out how to move forward. "Tom, Mrs. Patterson," he said finally, "I want you to know that Texas doesn't abandon its own. We're going to be here for the long haul, not just for the immediate crisis. But I also need to understand what that looks like from your perspective. What does coming back stronger mean to you?" Tom thought for a moment. "Better infrastructure. For one thing, we need power lines that can withstand storms like this, and drainage systems that actually work. But we also need economic support, help for small businesses to rebuild, incentives for new companies to come in, job training programs for folks whose industries might not come back," Mrs. Patterson added. "And we need to make sure that people like Maria and Miguel have a real chance to rebuild their lives here, not just temporary housing, but permanent solutions that give them stability and hope." Abbott looked around the gymnasium, taking in the scope of the human drama surrounding them. He'd come here expecting to offer comfort and assess the immediate needs, but he was beginning to understand that this crisis was also an opportunity, a chance to rebuild these communities in a way that would make them more resilient and more prosperous than they'd been before. "Y'all are asking the right questions," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made up his mind. "And I'm going to make sure we have the right answers." As the afternoon wore on, Governor Abbott found himself in the shelter's makeshift medical area, where a volunteer nurse was checking on an elderly man who'd been injured during the storm. The man, weathered and proud despite his circumstances, looked up as Abbott approached. "You're the governor," the man said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "I'm Earl Watson. Lived in this county my whole life, 73 years, Abbott positioned his wheelchair beside the cot where Earl was resting. "Mr. Watson, I'm honored to meet you. How are you feeling?" "I've been better," Earl replied with a wry smile, "but I've also been worse. Lost my leg in Vietnam, came back and built a good life here. Raised for kids. Ran a small auto repair shop for 30 years. This storm took my shop, but it didn't take my spirit." "Tell me about the shop," Abbott said, settling in for what he sensed would be an important conversation. Earl's eyes lit up despite his pain. "Watson's Auto Repair. Been in business since 1985. Nothing fancy. But I employed 6 people and we took care of folks who couldn't afford the big dealership prices. Problem is, most of my equipment was financed. And the insurance, well, let's just say it's not going to cover what I need to start over. Abbott nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Watson, what would it take to get you back in business? Honestly, more than I've got left to give. I'm 73 years old, Governor, starting over at my age. It's not easy to get people to loan you money when you might not live long enough to pay it back. The honesty in Earl's voice struck Abbott deeply. Here was a man who'd served his country, built a business, employed people, and contributed to his community for decades. The idea that he might not be able to rebuild because of age discrimination or bureaucratic obstacles was exactly the kind of injustice that had driven Abbott into public service in the first place. Mr. Watson, Abbott said firmly, men like you are the backbone of Texas. You've earned the right to rebuild, and we're going to make sure you have that opportunity. Earl looked skeptical. That's kind of you to say, Governor, but I've heard promises before. This isn't a promise, Mr. Watson. This is a commitment. I'm going to have my staff work with you personally to navigate the insurance issues, and we're going to find a way to get you the financing you need. Texas needs Watson's auto repair back in business. As Abbott spoke, he could see the doubt in Earl's eyes beginning to give way to something else. Not quite hope yet, but at least the possibility of hope. It was a look he'd seen before during his years as Attorney General when he'd fought for individuals against faceless bureaucracies, and it reminded him why he'd chosen public service over private practice. Governor, Earl said quietly, I appreciate that more than you know. But what about all the other folks like me? The ones who don't get to talk to you personally? It was a fair question, and Abbott respected Earl for asking it. Mr. Watson, that's exactly why I'm here. I'm not just learning about your situation. I'm learning about the challenges that people like you face so we can create programs that help everyone, not just the folks who happen to get FaceTime with the governor. Their conversation was interrupted by Jennifer Martinez, Abbott's chief of staff, who approached with a tablet full of urgent messages. Governor, we need to discuss the federal response. FEMA is finally ready to deploy, but they're asking for assurances about state coordination that could delay aid distribution. Abbott looked at the screen, his jaw tightening as he read the bureaucratic language. Jennifer, tell FEMA that Texas doesn't need assurances. We need action. If they can't move fast enough, we'll continue to handle this ourselves, sir. That could create some political complications, especially if we're seen as being uncooperative with the federal government. Abbott's response was immediate and decisive. Jennifer, I don't give a damn about political complications. The people in this shelter need help now, not after some federal bureaucrat finishes checking all the boxes on his forms. We're going to do what's right for Texas, period. Earl Watson had been listening to this exchange with growing admiration. Governor, I can see why folks voted for you. You're not afraid to ruffle feathers when it matters. Mr. Watson, I've been ruffling feathers my whole career, Abbott replied with a slight smile. Sometimes that's what it takes to get things done. As Jennifer walked away to deal with the federal coordination issues, Abbott turned back to Earl. Mr. Watson, I want you to know that this conversation has been important for me. You've helped me understand that our response to this crisis needs to be about more than just immediate relief. It needs to be about giving people like you the tools to rebuild your lives and your businesses. Earl nodded slowly. Governor, I believe you mean that. But meaning it and making it happen are two different things. You're right, Abbott acknowledged. But I've got a pretty good track record of making things happen when I set my mind to it, and right now, I'm setting my mind to making sure that Texas comes back from this stronger than before. As Abbott moved on to visit other families in the shelter, Earl Watson watched him go with a mixture of respect and cautious optimism. He'd met politicians before, but this felt different. This felt like a man who understood that leadership meant more than just making speeches and signing bills. It meant being willing to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. By evening, Governor Abbott had spoken with more than 50 families in the shelter, and each conversation had added another layer to his understanding of the crises. He'd heard stories of loss and resilience, of small business owners facing bankruptcy and families struggling to find hope. But he'd also heard ideas, practical, thoughtful suggestions from people who knew their communities better than any government official ever could. Abbott had requested a meeting with the local officials and community leaders, which was now taking place in the school's library. Mayor Patricia Williams of Beaumont was there, along with county commissioners, school board members, and representatives from local churches and civic organizations. Governor, Mayor Williams began, "We can't thank you enough for coming here. Personally, the people needed to see that they hadn't been forgotten, and your presence has made a real difference in morale." Abbott nodded. "Mayor Williams, I appreciate that, but I didn't come here for morale. I came here to understand what we need to do to help these communities rebuild. And from what I've heard today, that's going to require some innovative thinking." County Commissioner Robert Lee spoke up. "Governor, the immediate needs are pretty clear: temporary housing, debris removal, infrastructure repair. But the long-term challenges are more complex. We've got small businesses that may never reopen, families considering leaving the area, and young people who don't see a future here. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about." Abbott replied, "I've been hearing variations of the same theme all day. People need hope. They need economic opportunity, and they need to know that their government is committed to their success for the long haul." Pastor Mike Johnson from First Baptist Church, who'd been coordinating much of the volunteer relief effort, leaned forward. "Governor, what we're seeing is that people are willing to work, willing to rebuild, but they need to know that there's a plan. They need to see that their sacrifice and effort will lead to something better." Abbott had been taking notes throughout the meeting, but now he set his pen down and looked around the room. "I've been in public service for a long time, and I've learned that the best policies come from listening to the people they're meant to help. Today, I've heard some ideas that I think could transform not just the recovery, but the future of these communities." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "First, we need to streamline the bureaucracy. I met a man today, Earl Watson, who's been running an auto repair shop for 30 years. He wants to rebuild, but he's facing insurance complications and financing challenges that have nothing to do with his ability to run a successful business. We need to create a one-stop shop for businesses trying to rebuild, a place where they can get all their permits, financing, and regulatory issues resolved without being shuffled between a dozen different offices." Mayor Williams nodded enthusiastically. "That would be revolutionary, Governor. Small business owners spend more time dealing with paperwork than running their businesses." "Second," Abbott continued, "we need to think about infrastructure differently. Instead of just rebuilding what was there before, we need to build for the future. Better power grids, improved drainage systems, and modern communications infrastructure that can attract new businesses and support existing ones." Commissioner Lee asked, "Governor, that sounds expensive. Are we talking about state funding, federal funding, or some combination?" "We're talking about Texas funding," Abbott replied firmly. "We're going to use every federal dollar we can get, but we're not going to wait for Washington to decide whether our people are worth helping. Texas takes care of its own." Pastor Johnson raised his hand. "Governor, what about the human infrastructure, the families, the schools, the community organizations that hold these places together?" Abbott's expression grew more serious. "Pastor, that's where I need your help, and the help of everyone in this room. Government can provide resources and remove obstacles, but it can't create community. That has to come from people like you, people who are committed to this place and these people for the long haul." The room was quiet for a moment as everyone absorbed the scope of what Abbott was proposing. Finally, Mayor Williams spoke up. "Governor, this sounds like more than just disaster recovery. This sounds like a complete revitalization program." "Mayor Williams, that's exactly what it is," Abbott confirmed. "I don't want to just restore these communities to where they were before the storm. I want to make them stronger, more prosperous, and more resilient than they've ever been. And I want to do it in a way that serves as a model for other communities across Texas." As the meeting continued, Abbott found himself energized by the possibilities. He'd come to East Texas expecting to provide comfort and assess immediate needs, but he was leaving with the framework for something much more ambitious, a comprehensive approach to community rebuilding that could transform not just the storm-damaged areas, but the entire state's approach to economic development and disaster Recovery, the storm had taken much from these communities, but it had also revealed their strength, their resilience, and their potential. Abbott was determined to make sure that potential was realized, and that the people who'd suffered through this crisis would emerge stronger than before. As the meeting concluded, and Abbott prepared to return to Austin, he knew that the real work was just beginning. But for the first time since the crisis began, he felt confident that they had a plan worthy of the people they were trying to help. 2 weeks after Governor Abbott's visit to the shelter, Maria Gonzalez stood in front of a small but sturdy manufactured home in a new development just outside Beaumont. The keys felt heavy in her hand, not from their weight, but from the magnitude of what they represented. Miguel was running around the small front yard, his laughter echoing across the quiet street. "Mama, is this really ours?" he called out, his face beaming with joy. "Yes, mio," Maria replied, her voice thick with emotion. "This is really ours." The home was part of the Texas Rebuild Initiative, a program that Governor Abbott had announced just 3 days after his visit to the shelter. Unlike traditional government housing programs that could take months or years to process applications, the Texas Rebuild Initiative had been designed to cut through bureaucracy and get families into permanent housing as quickly as possible. Jennifer Martinez, who'd been personally overseeing the program's implementation, approached Maria with a clipboard and a warm smile. "Maria, how does everything look? Is there anything else you need to get settled?" "Ms. Martinez, I still can't believe this is happening," Maria said, wiping away tears. "When Governor Abbott made that promise to Miguel, I wanted to believe him. But, well, I've heard promises before, Maria. Governor Abbott doesn't make promises he can't keep," Jennifer replied. "And this is just the beginning. We've enrolled you in the job training program, and there's a child care center opening next month just 2 blocks from here. So you won't have to worry about Miguel while you're working or in classes." As they talked, Miguel came running up with something clutched in his small hands. "Mama, look what I found." Maria looked down to see a small tabby cat rubbing against Miguel's legs. Her heart skipped a beat. "Miguel, that's Whiskers," the boy exclaimed. "She found us, Mama. She found our new house." Jennifer smiled. "Actually, Miguel, Whiskers didn't find you by accident. Governor Abbott had his staff working with animal control and local shelters to track down pets that were separated from their families during the storm. We found her at a shelter in Orange County and brought her here this morning." Maria stared at Jennifer in disbelief. "The governor? He remembered about Whiskers, Maria. Governor Abbott remembers every conversation he had at that shelter, every family, every story, every promise. That's just who he is." Meanwhile, across town, Earl Watson was standing in the bay of his newly rebuilt auto repair shop, watching as the last piece of equipment was installed. The shop was bigger than his old one, with modern lifts, diagnostic equipment, and energy-efficient lighting. But what impressed him most was the sign above the door, "Watson's Auto Repair," a Texas Rebuild success story. Tom Henderson, who'd become something of an unofficial spokesman for the storm survivors, walked into the shop carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Earl, this place looks incredible. How are you feeling about the grand reopening?" "Tom, I'll be honest with you," Earl replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. 3 weeks ago, I thought my working days were over. I was ready to sell what was left of my tools and retire to some cheap apartment somewhere. But Governor Abbott, he didn't just help me rebuild my business. He helped me remember why I loved this work in the first place. The Texas Rebuild Initiative had provided Earl with low-interest financing, streamlined permits, and even connected him with a business mentor who'd helped him modernize his operations. But more than that, it had given him a renewed sense of purpose and dignity. "Earl, you've already got a waiting list of customers a mile long," Tom pointed out. "And I heard you're planning to hire more people than you had before." "That's right," Earl confirmed with pride. "We're going to employ 10 people, and we're partnering with the community college to offer apprenticeships for young folks who want to learn the trade. Governor Abbott calls it growing from within, and I reckon that's exactly what we're doing." As the 2 men talked, Mrs. Patterson walked by the shop's large windows, moving more slowly than usual but with a determined purpose. She was on her way to the new community center that had been built as part of the reconstruction effort. The center housed not just administrative offices for the various rebuilding programs, but also a senior center, a job training facility, and meeting spaces for local organizations. Mrs. Patterson had been appointed to the Community Advisory Board, a group of local residents who worked directly with state officials to ensure that the rebuilding efforts stayed true to the community's needs and values. It was a role she took seriously, viewing it as her responsibility to speak for neighbors who might not have a voice in the process. At the community center, she found Governor Abbott waiting for her, along with the other board members. This was his third visit to the area since the storm, and his presence no longer drew crowds of onlookers. He'd become a familiar figure, someone who kept his word and followed through on his commitments. Mrs. Patterson, Abbott greeted her warmly. "How are you feeling about the progress we've made, Governor? I have to admit, you've surprised me," she replied with a slight smile. "When you first came to the shelter, I thought you were just another politician looking for a photo opportunity. But you've proven me wrong," Abbott chuckled. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm glad to hear that, but I hope you'll keep holding us accountable. The moment we stop listening to voices like yours is the moment we start failing the people we're trying to serve." The advisory board meeting was focused on the next phase of the rebuilding effort, economic development. The immediate housing and infrastructure needs had been largely addressed, but the long-term success of the community would depend on creating sustainable economic opportunities. "Governor," said Rebecca Martinez, a local teacher who served on the board, "the families are settled, the businesses are reopening, but we need to think about the future. How do we make sure our young people have reasons to stay here instead of moving to Houston or Dallas?" Abbott nodded thoughtfully. "Rebecca, that's exactly why we're expanding the initiative to include technology infrastructure and education partnerships. We're bringing high-speed internet to every home and business, and we're working with universities to establish satellite campuses and remote learning opportunities." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. "Governor, what about manufacturing? This area used to have good-paying factory jobs, but most of those companies moved overseas years ago." "Mrs. Patterson, we're addressing that too," Abbott replied. "We're offering incentives for companies that want to relocate manufacturing operations back to Texas, and we're prioritizing areas like this one that have been through hardship. American manufacturing is coming back, and Texas is going to lead the way." As the meeting continued, Abbott found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that first day at the shelter. The communities affected by the storm were not just recovering, they were thriving in ways that exceeded everyone's expectations. But more importantly, the Texas Rebuild Initiative had become a model that other states were studying and trying to replicate. 6 months after the storm, the transformation of East Texas had caught the attention of news outlets across the country. Governor Abbott found himself fielding calls from governors of other states, congressional representatives, and even federal officials who wanted to understand how Texas had managed such a successful rebuilding effort. On a crisp October morning, Abbott was back in Beaumont for the dedication of the new Regional Emergency Management Center, a state-of-the-art facility that would serve as a model for disaster preparedness and response across Texas. But before the official ceremony, he had one more important visit to make. Maria Gonzalez greeted him at the door of her home, which now featured a small garden and a fresh coat of paint. Miguel, who had grown noticeably taller, came running from the backyard with whiskers following close behind. "Governor Abbott," Miguel called out excitedly, "look what I made in school." He held up a drawing of a man in a wheelchair surrounded by people, with the words "My Hero" written across the top. Abbott studied the drawing carefully, his expression growing soft. "Miguel, this is beautiful, but you know, the real heroes are your mama and all the other folks who've worked so hard to rebuild their lives." "Maybe," Miguel replied seriously, "but Mama says you kept your promises, and that makes you a hero too." Maria invited Abbott inside for coffee, and as they sat in her small but comfortable living room, she shared the latest developments in her life. She'd completed her job training program and was now working as a medical assistant at the new Community Health Center. More importantly, she was taking college courses online, working toward a degree in nursing. "Governor, I never thought I'd be able to go to college," she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Between work and raising Miguel, it just seemed impossible. But the support programs you created, they made it possible for me to dream bigger than I ever had before." Abbott smiled. "Maria, you're the one doing the work. We just removed some of the obstacles that were in your way. It's more than that," she insisted, "when you came to that shelter, when you looked Miguel in the eye and made him a promise. You weren't just talking about housing or jobs. You were telling us that we mattered, that our lives had value, and that Texas wasn't going to give up on us." As Abbott prepared to leave for the dedication ceremony, Miguel tugged on his sleeve. "Governor Abbott, when I grow up, I want to help people like you do." "Miguel," Abbott replied, kneeling down to the boy's level, "you're already helping people. Every time you're kind to someone, every time you work hard in school, every time you help your mama, you're making your community stronger. That's how real change happens, one person, one family, one community at a time." The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people from across East Texas, including many of the families Abbott had met at the shelter. Earl Watson was there with his employees, wearing matching shirts that read Watson's Auto Repair, Rebuilt, Renewed, Resilient. Tom Henderson and Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, representing the community advisory board that had become a permanent fixture of local government. In his speech, Abbott reflected on the journey from that first day at the shelter to the thriving communities that surrounded them now. "6 months ago, we faced a choice," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We could have simply restored what was damaged, patched things up, and moved on. But the people of East Texas demanded something better. They demanded a future worthy of their sacrifice and their resilience." He paused, looking out at the faces in the crowd, faces he recognized, stories he remembered. "What we've accomplished here isn't just about recovering from a storm. It's about proving that when government listens to people instead of lecturing them, when we trust communities to know what they need instead of telling them what they should want, incredible things can happen." The ceremony concluded with the announcement that the Texas Rebuild Initiative would be expanded statewide, creating a permanent framework for disaster recovery and community development. Other states had already begun sending delegations to study the Texas model, and there was talk of federal legislation based on what had been accomplished in East Texas. But for Abbott, the real measure of success wasn't in the headlines or the policy papers. It was in the faces of people like Maria and Miguel, Earl Watson, Tom Henderson, and Mrs. Patterson, ordinary Texans who'd been given extraordinary opportunities to rebuild their lives and their communities. As the crowd began to disperse, Abbott found himself surrounded by many of the families he'd met at the shelter. They wanted to shake his hand, share their latest news, and thank him for keeping his promises. But what struck him most was how they talked about their future with confidence and hope, how they'd moved from victims of circumstance to authors of their own success stories. "Governor," Mrs. Patterson said, approaching him as the crowd thinned, "I have something to tell you. My granddaughter graduated from college last month, and she's moving back here to work at the new technology center. She said she wants to be part of what we're building here." Abbott's face lit up. "Mrs. Patterson, that's wonderful news. What's she going to be doing?" "She's a computer engineer, and she's going to help manage the broadband infrastructure project. But more than that, she's going to be raising her own children here, in the community we've rebuilt together." As Abbott made his way back to his vehicle, he reflected on Mrs. Patterson's words. The storm had taken much from these communities, but it had also given them something precious, the opportunity to build something better, something stronger, something that would last for generations. 1 year after the storm, Governor Abbott returned to East Texas for what had become an annual tradition, the Community Resilience Festival. What had started as a simple commemoration of the rebuilding effort had evolved into a celebration of everything these communities had accomplished and a showcase for other areas looking to replicate their success. The festival was held in the new downtown district of Beaumont, where empty lots and damaged buildings had been transformed into a vibrant commercial and residential area. Local businesses thrived alongside new enterprises, that had been attracted by the combination of modern infrastructure, skilled workforce, and business-friendly policies that had emerged from the rebuilding effort. Abbott's first stop was Watson's Auto Repair, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for small business owners and policymakers. Studying the Texas Rebuild Initiative, Earl Watson, now 74 but more energetic than ever, greeted Abbott with a firm handshake and a proud smile. "Governor, you've got to see what we've accomplished this year," Earl said, leading Abbott through the expanded facility. "We're not just fixing cars anymore. We're training the next generation of mechanics and running a small manufacturing operation for custom auto parts." The shop buzzed with activity as young apprentices worked alongside experienced mechanics. And in the back, a new 3D printing operation was producing specialty parts for classic cars. Earl had partnered with the community college to create a comprehensive automotive technology program that was attracting students from across the region. "Earl, this is incredible," Abbott said, watching a young woman demonstrate the 3D printing process to a group of visitors. "How many people are you employing now?" 23 full-time employees, plus 15 apprentices who are getting paid while they learn, Earl replied with obvious pride. "And we're profitable, Governor. We're not just surviving, we're thriving." As they talked, Maria Gonzalez appeared at the shop's entrance, wearing scrubs and carrying a nursing school textbook. She was in her final semester of the RN program and had been doing her clinical rotations at the regional medical center that had been built as part of the reconstruction effort. "Governor Abbott," she called out, approaching with Miguel, who was now 9 and had grown considerably. "We were hoping we'd see you today." "Maria, Miguel." Abbott greeted them warmly. "How are things going with your studies?" "I graduate in 3 months," Maria replied, her voice filled with quiet accomplishment. "And I've already been offered a position at the medical center. Miguel and I are going to stay right here in Beaumont, in our community." Miguel, who had been listening to the adults talk, spoke up. "Governor Abbott, I'm in the gifted program at school now, and I want to study engineering so I can help build things like you do." Abbott smiled at the boy's ambition. "Miguel, I think you're going to make an excellent engineer. But remember, the most important thing you can build is community, bringing people together to solve problems and help each other." As they walked through the festival, Abbott was struck by how naturally the rebuilt communities had integrated innovation with tradition. The new downtown featured cutting-edge technology and modern amenities, but it was designed around the courthouse square and Main Street pattern that had defined Texas towns for generations. At the main stage, Tom Henderson was serving as master of ceremonies for a panel discussion about disaster preparedness and community resilience. The panel included local leaders, state officials, and representatives from other states and countries who had come to study the Texas model. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom announced to the crowd, "it's my privilege to introduce someone who didn't just promise to help us rebuild. He helped us reimagine what our community could become. Please welcome Governor Greg Abbott." As Abbott took the stage, he looked out at a crowd that included many familiar faces from that first day at the shelter, but also newcomers who had been attracted to the area by the opportunities that had been created through the rebuilding effort. Young families, entrepreneurs, retirees, and students filled the square, representing the diverse and dynamic community that had emerged from the storm's devastation. "My friends," Abbott began, his voice carrying easily across the crowd, "when I first came here a year ago, I met people who had lost everything but had not lost hope. I met families who were determined to rebuild not just their homes, but their dreams. I met business owners who saw opportunity where others saw only obstacles." He paused, looking directly at faces he recognized in the crowd. "What we've accomplished here together proves something important about the American spirit and the Texas character. When government gets out of the way and gives people the tools they need to succeed, there's no limit to what they can achieve." The governor went on to outline how the lessons learned in East Texas were being applied across the state. The Texas Rebuild Initiative had been expanded into a comprehensive economic development program that was helping rural communities diversify their economies, urban areas improve their infrastructure, and border regions strengthen their security. and economic ties. But the real success isn't measured in statistics or budget numbers. Abbott continued, "It's measured in the dreams that have been fulfilled, the families that have been strengthened, and the communities that have been transformed. It's measured in young people like Miguel Gonzalez who see a future worth staying for, and experienced workers like Earl Watson who have found new purpose in mentoring the next generation." As Abbott concluded his remarks, he announced the establishment of the Texas Community Resilience Institute, a permanent center that would be housed in East Texas and would serve as a training ground for community leaders, disaster response professionals, and policy makers from around the world. "This institute will ensure that what we've learned here doesn't stay here," Abbott explained. "We're going to share our knowledge, our experience, and our model with anyone who wants to build stronger, more resilient communities." After the ceremony, Abbott spent the rest of the day visiting with families, touring new businesses, and meeting with the Community Advisory Board that had become a model for citizen participation in government. As evening approached, he found himself back at the community center where Mrs. Patterson was hosting a reception for the visiting delegations. "Governor," Mrs. Patterson said, approaching him with a cup of coffee and her characteristic directness, "I want you to know that you've changed more than just our buildings and our economy. You've changed how people think about what's possible." Abbott considered her words carefully. "Mrs. Patterson, I think what we've really done is remind people of something they already knew, but had maybe forgotten, that Americans don't give up, Texans don't back down, and communities that stick together can overcome anything." As the sun set over the transformed landscape of East Texas, Governor Abbott reflected on the journey from that first day at the shelter to this moment of celebration and success. The storm had been devastating, but it had also been an opportunity to prove that principled leadership, innovative thinking, and unwavering commitment to people over politics could create lasting change. The families he'd met that day had not just rebuilt their lives, they had built something better than what they'd lost. They had created communities that were more resilient, more prosperous, and more hopeful than ever before. And in doing so, they had provided a model for the rest of Texas and the nation. As Abbott prepared to return to Austin, he knew that his work in East Texas was far from over. The Texas Rebuild Initiative would continue to evolve. The Community Resilience Institute would expand its reach, and the lessons learned here would influence policy decisions for years to come. But most importantly, the people of East Texas had proven that with the right support, the right opportunities, and the right leadership, any community could not just survive adversity, but emerge stronger from it. They had shown that the American dream was alive and well in Texas, and that the best days for these communities were still ahead. In Maria Gonzalez's nursing career, Miguel's engineering aspiration, Earl Watson's expanded business, and Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter's decision to return home, Abbott saw the true legacy of their work together, a future filled with hope, opportunity, and the unshakable belief that in Texas, no challenge is too great and no dream is too big.